Everyone arriving. Just gonna wait another minute here, give people a little more time. Joseph, I'll give you a little introduction first when we get started.
Sounds good.
Yep. Hey, so just gonna take a minute here to welcome everybody to Homecoming 2022. We've made it somehow. If you live in the area, we're looking forward to seeing you at some of our events. We've got a lot of fun in-person things we'll be doing. We've got our Cowboy Lounge Friday evening. Saturday, we've got the 5K run. If any of you have participated in that before, that'll be in the morning at the golf course. We're also excited for our tailgate and, of course, the football game. So, and if you're not here in person, we're excited that you can join us for these HU talks on Zoom and participate a little bit with us. We're going to get started with our HU talk shortly. The host, that's me, will mute everyone as we begin. And unmute people when it's time for the Q&A session. If you just want to either raise your hand or just type in the chat a question, we can read that aloud. Whichever you prefer will be fine. But we ask that you stay muted until the end of the talk and when we open up for that Q&A. The session and all sessions will be recorded and made accessible for future viewing. So if you miss anything, have to step out or coming in a little late, we'll have those for you to view later. And we extend our thanks to the student language interpreters we have here today and their coordinator, Carol Litherland, for providing this wonderful service. And otherwise, please join me in welcoming Dr. Joseph Moreno, who will be giving his HU talk entitled New Mexico Spanish, Yo Sego from Over There.
All righty, well, thank you very much, everyone, for coming this morning. I have other interests in addition to New Mexico Spanish. I do a lot of work with the Matachines group in Bernalillo, but particularly for those who I have not had the joy of meeting, I'm the Metro Center manager down at the Rio Rancho and Albuquerque centers for Highlands. And I've been here for about 3-ish years, and I've enjoyed it. I think it's a great institution for the study of these types of issues and our language and culture. And most recently, I defended my dissertation at UNM in a program called Language, Literacy, and Sociocultural Studies, which is through the College of Education. So it was mainly on an interest of mine in pursuing language and cultural revitalization and maintenance in northern New Mexico communities, particularly in Bernalillo. So what I did was looked critically at cultural traditions, our language, through critical race theory and through Latino critical race theory to understand how participants in the class who were adults from Bernalillo grappled with issues of race, class, and power intersecting with our language and cultural traditions. So this is one of the products of that. And so we'll go through that today and discuss the beauty of our dialect of Spanish and how we see some of these unique traits in our language being spoken. And I can't see some of you guys, but I'm assuming most of you are from northern New Mexico. And so you'll hear words that are similar or they sound familiar, for example. And so we'll go through some of that today. So I usually like to start with a famous northern New Mexican comedian named Gabriel de la Plaga or Carlos Medina. And I don't know if he's still doing this on social media, but he has a Norte Saint of the Day where he goes through and discusses different topics that he wants to present that particular day. So I'm going to play this and listen to some of the intricacies. There's different languages in there. There's different dialectical pieces in there. So I'm just going to play it and hopefully you are able to hear it.
Today's Norte Saint of the Day comes from yesterday. Me and my carnal James Ramirez went to eat lunch at Wek, no, here in Santa. Anyway, entró una mujer ahí con un solite stick, no. And she sat down ahí y al ratito llegó su marido. And he looks at her and he tells her like this, "Quéjate, lipstick and sales, porque pareces un clown." That's the Norte Saint of the Day. Quéjate, lipstick and sales. Later.
So for those of you who are familiar with Carlos, he uses very many different types of language in this saying. He uses, of course, English, Nuevo Mexicano, Spanish. So let's talk a little bit about that. So the area that we're talking about in terms of northern New Mexico, of course, you all in Vegas probably would not claim that Albuquerque and Bernalillo are the part of the north, but linguistically and culturally, we very much are. From as far south as Socorro, north into southern Colorado, and then east and west, from the Las Vegas to the Rio Puerto Valley area. So you can see the map on the left shows kind of this homeland, if you will, this Hispano homeland that we talk about, and the larger dots are showing the highest concentration of Nuevo Mexicanos in the region. And then on the right-hand side, you could see kind of where Aurelio Espinosa drew kind of this homeland of Nuevo Mexicano area. So when we talk about Nuevo Mexicanos, it's more of a term that we're using now to discuss the Spanish-speaking people of northern New Mexico and southern Colorado, that where identity markers can include language and our unique dialect, but also history and culture, and also religion. Those are coming together to form unique identity markers for people who live in this homeland. One thing to note is that these folks do not typically identify as Mexicano or Mexican or Mexican American. So we see in the research, there's this distinct mark, self-identification between both of these groups, and Nuevo Mexicanos typically don't refer to themselves as these, but they do refer to themselves as Spanish, the anglicized term and the census term of Hispanic, and also Hispano. Should we look at the language family that Spanish and English, for example, the two main languages that we're speaking, we're looking at an Indo-European Spanish language and a completely different English language. But then we also have things like the Nahuatl or Uto-Aztecan languages, or Chanawan and Kerizan, which we'll see in a bit from the Pueblos. So I won't go through this whole craziness of a historical background in terms of how the language got to New Mexico, but we really see at the time of contact between the Spanish, namely Hernan Cortez, when he overthrew the Aztec Empire, where Cuauhtemoc was the last Aztec ruler. At that time, there were certain things that the Aztecs possessed that the Europeans did not have words for. So a lot of Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, a lot of words were incorporated into the Spanish language at that time. And we'll see which ones did, or examples of some. In 1540, Coronado established or explored present-day New Mexico, with Juan de Oñate establishing the capital as part of New Spain. And at this time, we see this archaic, I hate to say the word archaic, but it's a very old Castellano or Castilian spoken. A lot of people tend to, or researchers tend to say that northern New Mexico language or Spanish language is pure Castilian. And we'll see it's not. It's really a mixture of many beautiful languages coming together with certain Castilian words that we'll see in a second. But in 1680, the Pueblo Revolt happened, where the Spanish were exiled to the current El Paso area. And when de Vargas came back in 1693, we saw because Spanish became the lingua franca, we really see very few Rio Grande Pueblo words incorporated, but we'll see a few today. And then in the 19th and 20th centuries, we'll see that petitions for statehood when New Mexico became a territory and was finally granted in 1912, we saw Spanish begin to quickly be supplanted by English. We see things like code switching, we see Hispanicizing English words, and then we also see the Pachuco movement, which influenced our language. So let's talk about some of these Castilian examples. So in contemporary Spanish or standard, a form of standard Spanish, we would say mucho, but in old northern New Mexico Spanish, we would say mucho. There's a slight difference in the N that you can hear. So if you're listening to Spanish music and the band typically comes from the Las Vegas area or Espanol or Taos, you can hear them say mucho in their songs. We also hear things like instead of mismo, you hear mesmo, or camanta instead of cama for bed. But in my title, we typically say we say yo soy Jose Moreno, but in our older dialect, in our Nuevo Mexicano dialect, we say yo Sego Jose. We say things like asina instead of así, or yo vide instead of vi. So these are very old words that still, because of New Mexico's isolation and a lot of those communities, especially in the north, because of that isolation, they were able to preserve some of these slight differences from what we see in standardized Spanish. The other things we see, some of these are most of them are influences from northern Mexico. So on the top left-hand corner, with some of the things we do in Nuevo Mexicano dialect is we drop the D and ado endings. So instead of saying callado, we'll say callao. ¿Por qué eres tan callao? Or cuidado instead of cuidado, emocional. So I hope some of you are smiling out there because we can hear our language when we hear these types of words and what we do. We also change the do or you verb endings. So instead of saying callaste, we'll switch it to callates or jugates, or instead of hablaste, we'll say hablates. Another thing that we do is we replace the C or S sounds with G or J. So instead of acequia, we'll say things like ajequia or nosotros instead of nosotros. The final thing on this slide is we replace B and B sounds. So sometimes instead of saying bosque, we'll say bosque, or vaso instead of vaso, or vaso instead of vaso, or viejo instead of viejo. So you could see there's this evolution in terms of the different regions, Old Spanish, Old Castilian, and now Northern Mexico variations. We also have things where we switch the SH sounds. So in contemporary Spanish, we would say things for monkey, we would say chango, but in Northern New Mexico dialect, we would say shango, or muchacho for muchacho. But we also do it in English, where we, instead of saying silla for chair, we would say share, or cheap for sheep. So you could see again how it's a variation of the standardized form. The next slide will show you the accent or stress and the double R's. So in contemporary Spanish, we would have the word for corn, we would say maíz, but New Mexico Spanish and Mexicanos tend to say this is where it's a little lazy that we don't stress that I, so we'll say maíz. Maíz and maíz. Raíz and rice for root. But also the double L's instead of torre for tower, we'll say things like torre. It's a very slight difference. You can barely hear it, but it's still there in terms of how our dialect is different. The Nahua influence, as I mentioned earlier, from the Aztecs. In English, for example, for owl, the Nahua word was tecolote, and the Spanish version, the New Mexico version, is tecolote, or words like cacahuate or chocolate, tomate. So things that the Europeans did not have became, and the interesting thing about tomato is the Italian cuisine is almost all based off of tomatoes, and tomatoes went east instead of west from the Aztecs to Europe. So that's just one potato. There are a number of words that we use, pozole, for example, tamale, that we use that are all Aztec in origin. We see two words really that we can find, at least in the Rio Grande Pueblo influence. particularly Kunques when we talk about coffee grounds, or Shakewe, which is the blue, typically the blue corn mush. One of the other things that I like to talk about when we speak about dialect is there's also a geographical difference in the northern way of saying different words and the southern New Mexico way of saying words. So this one's kind of hard to see. The scan didn't really come out really well, but Bills and B. Hill, the researchers at UNM, they went around New Mexico and started to ask people what they said for different words. And so, for example, this one is green bean. You can see the green marks are where people would say frijol verde, which is almost a literal translation. It is a literal translation, but you can see there's in the south, there's hijote, ejote, and hijote. So you can see it's almost I-40 south where we're talking about this difference and then the center part there with Albuquerque, there's such a diversity in Latinos that we see a mixing of all of those north and south coming together. On the left-hand side, we could see a distinct difference with the word cake. For example, in the north, typically they say queque, which is just the word of saying cake in English, but with the Spanish accent. And then you can see in the south, it's pastel or quequi, which is different. I've never seen that one, had never seen it before, but you could see again the example of north and south. And then apricot, you could see in the north, typically it's used as albarcoque. In the center part, it looks like they're using albercoque. And chabacan, which is very different from the center and the northern part. So on top of all that is if we have geographic differences, we have historical differences in Castilian to northern Mexico as Spain really expanded north into our region. We then had the Enabling Act of 1910, after we had been in a territory for a number of years. Part of the reason New Mexico didn't become a state for a long time was because a lot of Eastern senators, particularly Albert Beveridge from Indiana, really led this charge that said we were illiterate and we didn't know English. And that was one of the main reasons why we weren't allowed to be a state. But finally in 1910, we were literally enabled to create the beginnings of our state constitution. And if you notice that in this statute, it says that provisions shall be made for the establishment and maintenance of a system of public schools which will be open to all children of said state and free from sectarian control, and that said schools shall always be conducted in English. So that was the very beginning of when English started to replace our Spanish use, which was in existence for hundreds of years. These pieces of the New Mexico Constitution, we'd like to see that when our Constitution was created, that even though the Enabling Act said your schools have to be in English, Nuevo Mexicano leaders were really trying to make a push for the learning and teaching of English and Spanish. And you could see they published laws in English and Spanish. They were requiring teachers to learn English and Spanish when they would teach, quote unquote, kids of Spanish descent. So there was this battle, if you will, ideological battle of, well, your schools are in English only, but your teachers should know English and Spanish. So there was really this idea of bilingualism. And Las Vegas became a center and a hub, and Highlands did actually, for this idea of bilingualism and using our language to preserve our culture. So that said, the English influences we have in our language, in many ways we say, for the word Christmas, instead of Navidad in standard Spanish, we would say Christmas, Christmas, or gasoline instead of gasolina, teléfono, troca for camioneta. So you could see at this time we're starting to, and typically the way we do it now is if we can't think of the Spanish word, we'll just say it we'll say the English word in Spanish. And so a part of that meant that we were also doing what's called code switching. And so I'm just going to read this to you because code switching is using both Spanish and English, and syntactically they're working and they make sense when read. So This one says, hold on one second. Don Ramon no hace enjoy en los restaurants. He'd rather eat at home, even if it's only frijoles viejos y tortillas duras. But it's Father's Day and all the familia is taking him out to dinner at Red Steakhouse. So Don Ramon is dressing up and he's going because as Doña Clotilde says, más que no love it, él va a ir. And then there's another example from Bills and Be Hill where they say, and I bet you que en un diccionario that there's not such a word. So you could see this idea of code switching, which is huge in our language. And as English began to supplant our Northern New Mexico dialect. What does this mean though, as we step out into the real world? I mean, our communities are the real world, but as we move to throughout the country, different areas of the state, what did that mean? So our people were really forced to understand that this English only movement was really a way that they were to become American. So policy was really a part of stripping us of our heritage language. And because culture, language, and identity are related, when you start to tease one out from the other, it begins to unravel the idea of community and identity as well. And so we hear many, many stories about the physical punishment that our elders went through as they went to school, when they spoke in Spanish in the playground or in the classroom. Imagine the emotional abuse and trauma that would cause in the classroom when the language you bring from your home is literally beaten out of you. So that was the context of English only. And then policy started to do things like create the Pledge of Allegiance. Keep in mind that the United States, where we're at in New Mexico, was Spain for a long time, was Mexico for about 25 years, and then became the United States overnight with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So this idea of becoming American was an idea that in order to do that, part of it was to learn English and learn English only. And the schools were one of the ways where this was mainly occurring. The other thing that we see in the research is this idea of white bread sandwiches versus beans and tortillas. So we hear a lot of our elders talking about feeling less than or feeling poor and made fun of by other students if they didn't bring white bread sandwiches, because that was the thing at the time. That was the American symbol of not being poor. But kids that brought tortillas and beans to school were ridiculed. And so this idea of your food being less than, your language being less than. And then the other thing that we see in policy in schools was this idea of Protestant versus Catholicism religion and who was fighting for the influence of our kids. And one of the ways to make people feel bad about themselves, aside from taking them away from their language and their food ways, is to call them dirty. And part of the Protestant strategy was to create quote unquote hygiene programs to tell us that our kids had piojos, for example, and how to properly bathe our kids. So that is also traumatic because we see it today in the intergenerational carrying on of people who will not go to Walmart, for example, without taking a shower and looking well. But also things like don't wear socks that have holes in them, just in case if something happens and you get in an accident, then the paramedics are going to see that you're poor or less than because you have socks, holy socks, if you will. So this was all occurring in schools through our language use. And so what it did was it was really a way to assimilate Nuevo Mexicanos to the American society and to disassociate from Mexicanos, which caused issues, which we'll talk about in a second. The other thing that we see in our dialect is this idea of pachuquismo. So in the 1940s to 60s, this zoot suit culture in the big cities of El Paso, Denver, mainly LA, really influenced the language that was being used in these places, and it did not escape New Mexico. So we say things like shante, instead of casa, or ruca, or my rantla. So we see these pachuquismos from this Zoot Zoot culture also impacting our language. So far we have Castilian, we have Northern Mexican dialects that influenced us. We have Nahuatl, we have the Pueblos, and then now in English, and then now these pachuquismos in English. They're hybrid words as well. So we have a lot of layers in terms of how we speak our language. I won't read this whole slide, but there is a language ideology which basically says that we hierarchically position languages, and within a language, we also position different dialects over one another. So for example, what is it to speak? What does it mean to speak proper Spanish? What is proper Spanish? What's proper English, for example? So our language, our dialect tends to be relegated to a lesser language. So for example, when Nuevo Mexicanos and Mexicanos typically interact in places like schools, we see that, again, history, language, and culture, they form identity markers for both groups, but that people in those communities are using those things, those traits to differentiate between themselves. And it's rooted in the history of New Mexico. It's rooted in migration, on immigration, on statehood, you name it. It's been influenced from so long ago to the way we interact and the way we see our language identities and cultures now. So contemporarily, we see that there is discrimination in schools when Nuevo Mexicanos and Mexicanos are in the same classrooms. Mexicanos will typically say that Nuevo Mexicanos speak differently and the language is too Americanized because of the heavy presence of English. But Nuevo Mexicanos will distance themselves, on the other hand, and say, well, we do speak English, that's why we are different from you. And so you could see hierarchically, they're positioning themselves higher than more recently arrived Mexicanos from Mexico, or other Latinos, for example. And what Nuevo Mexicanos will take a step further, and they'll emphasize American citizenship or their Spanish heritage, history, and culture. So you could see how that speaks to the contemporary interactions between both of these groups particularly. Another thing that we see, this is an interest of mine recently, is we see this other thing called translanguaging, where it's Spanish and English use, but it's different from code switching, which we just saw a while ago. We're using the bilingual mind is a fascinating thing. It's fascinating in that the brain is always going between English and Spanish, for example, or any other languages. And so instead of saying, ábreme la puerta, it's a literal translation. We can hear people say, open me the door, or close the light. Or even in English, we'll switch it. Instead of vas a bajarte from the car, we'll say things like, are you gonna get down? So translanguaging is more recent, I would say, in the field, but it really is speaking to how we scaffold the two languages in school rather than compartmentalizing them and hierarchically positioning English over Spanish. So when I speak to people about our dialect of Nuevo Mexicano Spanish, I always ask, well, in America, in the US, which dialect of English is the correct version? Is it the one from New York and all their boroughs, or from Boston? We can hear these different dialects in our minds, the Great Lakes, California, Texas. Which one of these is correct? And my opinion is that all of them are correct, because there's a language ideology that surrounds that in an attempt to portray your culture, that your pride in your linguistic and cultural heritage in a way that can be inclusive, to look across cultures and identify the overlap linguistically and culturally between Mexicanos, Nuevo Mexicanos, and particularly Pueblos as well. So our dialect needs to be considered as a way in which we revitalize and maintain what we have, and take that next step to creating fully bilingual students in our dialect and also in English. So it takes a little bit of community planning. It takes community liaisons to assist in programs like dual language programs, in cultural maintenance and revitalization programs. and that languages and dialects are given equal prestige. In my research, when we were speaking about, my participants were speaking about our language, they would say, well, I speak much, or I don't speak proper Spanish. And that's where we have to, as community leaders, is say, well, what's much? I mean, we all understand much, so much is correct. And much, for those of you who don't understand, is it's a way of us almost denigrating our own language to give it less prestige than, say, the correct form of Spanish or standardized form. And so the main thing with schooling, of course, is that maintaining our heritage language doesn't inhibit learning English. And that has been what we've thought for many years, and why there has been so much language shift amongst the generations, and why it was really fast, and how language transmission from generation to generation was really, it was pretty quick how it happened, because there was this belief that in order for my kid to get ahead in life, I don't want them to go through what I went through. I was beaten for speaking our language, and I don't want my children to go through that. So it's reversing those effects. And so I'll finish, I went really quickly through that, but I'll finish with our joke and linguistics that we always like to say. And it's, what is it called when a person speaks 3 languages? Of course, and it's called trilingual. What is it called when a person speaks 2 languages? Of course, it's bilingual. But what is it called when a person speaks 1 language? And we like to joke and say American. So with that said, I'll stand for questions.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Joseph. Does anybody have any questions? Feel free to either type them in the chat, or you can use the raise your hand function.
I have a couple of questions, Dr. Moreno.
Sure.
I'm Manuel Garcia. I live in northeastern San Miguel County. I consider myself a Hispanic, so you talked about that. And I had an opportunity to go to a function when the Prince of Spain at that time came down to New Mexico. It must have been about 30 years ago. He came down to help dedicate the New Mexico Hispanic Cultural Center.
Sure.
And so I listened to him speak, and he spoke almost exactly the way we Hispanics speak here in New Mexico. So I also worked for the railroad many years ago, and I noticed that at that time in the 1970s, almost none of the young kids, the young Hispanics, spoke Spanish, and I was appalled.
Yeah.
So what do you see in that trend nowadays?
Sadly, thank you for being here. But sadly, I think we're at a point where we are unable to assess where we're at with our language use with the little ones. We know it's dire, but how dire is it in that our little ones are not speaking? For example, we have a dual language program in Bernalillo in our schools at the elementary level. And one of my little cousins was in the program, and the teacher, who's not from the community, put a picture up of an owl and asked the class, "What is this?" And my little cousin said, "Es un tecolote." And the teacher said, "No, that's false. Es un búho." And I think that's a microcosm of what can happen when in the classroom, our students are told that the language they hear from their grandparents, from their parents, for example, is false. So I think we have an issue of the perception of our language and having it be on par with English, first of all, and to truly create those kids of bilingual children with the idea that English is not being impacted, or it shouldn't be, when dual language programs and maintenance and revitalization programs are done correctly. So it's a nice thing though, to hear the little ones speak in Spanish. It warms my heart every time I hear them. But I think that we're at a place where we really need, if the schools were the place where our language was taken, it could be a place where we could revitalize them again.
So I'll have another question if nobody's,
Sure. We could probably talk all day, right?
of course. I've been a longtime member of the Hispano Roundtable and a long time member in addressing Hispano issues.
Yeah.
So could you talk a little bit more about the North, Central, and South? You know, I'm from the North.
Yeah.
And we have our politics. Maybe you could even talk briefly of the Patron system up North, because I retired from Sandia Labs after 27 years as a chemist over there. And when I moved to Albuquerque and worked at Sandia, I met people from down south in Belen and Los Lunas. And they were very different people, very nice people, by the way.
Right.
In a different way. So could you talk a little bit more about the people from the North, Central, and South New Mexico?
Sure. I think there's also an issue embedded in that idea of geography. There's also this idea of rural versus urban in New Mexico that we rarely talk about in things like this, where we could see different ways of speaking and different intricacies in the cultural traditions that we have, not just from north to south in the center, but also how close we are to cities like Albuquerque and Las Cruces. And even the foodways change, right? When we start to go around cities, red chili in Las Vegas and Taos and Española is very different from those in Las Cruces, for example. And so I think that rural versus urban divide almost is something that we don't talk a lot about in today's academia, if you will, in those discussions, to say that there are different ways of speaking, but those words are also indicative politically, I think, of the people who speak them, but also politically, geopolitically, right? Where they're at in relation to the center of power in the state, in relation to Santa Fe and the bigger cities. So I can write my contact information down in the chat box if you want to have more discussions, because I have so much to learn from you and others who have gone down this path before. And it's my hope that we can take what we've learned from you all and take the next step of ensuring that our culture and our language are a source of pride, and that we continue them into the next generations, because it was almost lost, if you will. So I'll write that in the chat box.
Okay.
But it really is, I mean, obviously I'm biased, but it really is a fascinating subject, how we use language and how we identify around the dialects that we use. And then you attach layers on that in terms of ideology, in terms of our language. A lot of people say in writing about the Spanish language, researchers will say, look, Spanish in New Mexico is not an endangered language, because you have new scores of Mexicanos coming from Mexico, but also other Latino American countries. But on the contrary, what we have to look at is, because there is a language ideology, that right away people will start to compartmentalize each other and themselves from other people, and almost maybe discriminate sometimes based on those dialects. So we don't have a way of saying we have an influx of speakers, so we're just going to adopt their dialect, because our identities are tied to this particular Northern New Mexico dialect. So I think that's some ways that we can really go in terms of how we begin to treat language and identity. And look, I'm closer to Albuquerque, and you know, Albuquerque has seen a large influx of Mexicano people and others. And so it's changed the dynamic of language and how we use language to either identify with one another or not. And I think it's happening everywhere as we see, you know, people coming from other countries. And so language is just one of those ways, I think, that we can start to use that lens to look at how we can interact and how our little ones can learn.
Hey, do you have any more questions from anybody?
I'm going to ask another question. If another person isn't, I'm going to ask another question.
Go for it. I don't see any other hands raised.
You can't
anybody
allow
wanna-
this.
Oh, where do you raise your hand?
This precious time that we
Oh,
have.
there's a little feature that allows you to raise your hand. Sorry, who was it that spoke? Oh, is
Some
it
of us,
Tina?
some of
Yeah,
us
I
have
don't
that.
see it.
Some of us don't have that. Some of us don't have that on our screen.
Feature. Oh, okay. Well, Manuel, do you mind if Tina asks a question first,
Go
and then
ahead.
you can
Go
go
ahead.
next?
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
So Joseph, this is Tina Clayton. I'm the director of the international office. And I received my degree in Spanish, but I don't know if you mentioned it as I'm multitasking while I listen to you. But I guess what I would like to say is that when I visited Spain, I was speaking, of course, the Spanish that I learned as a child. And it really fascinated the people of Spain because they said that the language that I was speaking to them was a very antiquated Spanish from way back in probably the 1400s. And it had a lot of mixture of Arabic words along with the Spanish words. So when I was there, I had somewhat of a not trouble, but trying to figure out what they were trying to tell me, because I was used to hearing the old word, according to them, compared to the new word. So I would get mixed up a lot. But I think that preserving our language is very important.
Right. And thank you for that. And so one of my biggest points that I try to make is, yes, we do have a connection to Spain. Yes, our language has those traits of Spain, but even Spain Spanish is very mixed, like you mentioned. And so it has, the words that come from Northern Africa, from different places. But then there's also this whole other landmass that was in between Europe and New Mexico, where it picked up a lot of words and was influenced in a lot of ways by native people. And so understanding, and even if we do, but saying it, that our language is, yes, from Spain, yeah, because it's Spanish, but it's also mixed in with a lot of other beautiful languages as well. But I think that's a great point that you make as well.
Thank you, Tina. And Manuel, if you wanted to ask your question now.
Yes. So you mentioned tortillas and white bread. So I kind of remember a little bit of that in my early days in like around 1960 in Colorado. I was in the 3rd grade in Colorado. So yes, white bread was plentiful, and we didn't dare take any tortillas to school because that wasn't really allowed.
Right.
But now, 60, 70 years later, the white people love Hispanic food and tortillas.
Right. And they're almost appropriating it for us, right? Is to say what's good chili and what's good tortillas, rather than us saying, wait a minute. We've been making these for hundreds of years, and we were told that we couldn't bring this stuff to school because it was less than. And so those became symbols of the old and the new when the American, when this became the US. And it's traumatizing if you think you don't even want to eat when you think that something is less than. And you don't want to bring it to school. And also in my research, some of the participants said that even the lunchbox, they wouldn't want to bring like the lard container, empty lard container with their beans and chili or tortillas, because to not have like a lunchbox was even like viewed as less than.
Hey, Dana, you have your hand raised there.
Yes, hi, Dr. Moreno. Thank you so much. This was a really fascinating presentation. I'm from the European Caucasian American background, so I can't speak to any of this, but I do remember even when I was young, the international people in my groups, like 80s and 90s, there was this push that their parents didn't want to teach them their languages and to kind of assimilate. Are there any success stories with any certain groups that have managed really well to bring their cultures back within the American culture, that or any as you're trying to preserve your culture, excuse me, and language, are there any studies that you're kind of basing it off of?
Thank you for that question. I think that English is a very powerful language, and psychologically, I think for people who have gone through generational removal of language like we have, I think that because it's caused that trauma and it disrupted the transmission of our language, not only in public spaces, but also in the home. I think because of the power of English, it's very difficult to find examples of that. But again, there are opportunities. And I think we're at a point where for example, in New Mexico, we have a legislature that has really put an emphasis on language and culture learning and also bilingual ed and now with the Martinez-Yazzie cases. So I think that we have an opportunity to really bring people together to create some synergy for this. But again, English is very hard because as I can't speak to other groups of people, but at least for what I know and what I'm familiar with, we default to English almost always because that's the language of commerce, it's the language of politics in our country. And so again, that hierarchy of language really comes into play when we're forced to speak either one. And so yeah, it's difficult to find something that an example, but hopefully in a few years we'll be sitting here with a different story and we can say that we've successfully implemented. And some of these programs, what I'd say is each community is different, how you are going to revitalize and maintain language and culture. And so it has to be organically grown with community and school groups coming together.
Thank you. I look forward to hearing more about this program you're starting.
Sure. Thank you.
I see another hand raised. Patricia?
Hi, Joe. This is Patricia. I just wanted to chime in real quick because my mom actually talked a lot about how when she was small, she'd get hit for speaking Spanish. So how I learned Spanish was listening to her talk to my tios and tias when they didn't want us to know what they were talking about.
Right.
So I learned all my Spanish from there, but I struggle as an adult because I can understand it. I just can't reply. So
Right.
That's been a struggle for me and my kids, even just passing it on to my kids.
For sure. And I agree, Patricia. The thing is a lot of that was conversational Spanish. And then we get put into a classroom where their full sentence is being spoken. And that's a different level of literacy that sometimes we are not prepared for when our parents are trying to say something about us. And then we learn all the bad words and things like that too. But that's a great point, is that this difference between conversational and more of a higher register Spanish, when it's difficult for us to respond sometimes in full sentences because of that issue and the disruption of transmission in the home.
Thank you, definitely.
And for me, I was the same way, Patricia. So I don't know if I told you my background, but I'm about a fourth or fifth generation Bernalilloan, and both families came from the Rio Puerto Valley near the Cabezon, San Luis, Cuba area. And I didn't know Spanish. And there was one day when my whole family was together and my grandmother said in Spanish, "How sad is it that my grandkids don't respond to me in Mexicano," she said, not Spanish, she said Mexicano. And I thought that was really sad because she would speak to us in Spanish and we would understand her and we'd speak back to her in English. And it's sad. So one of my goals was to learn Spanish by doing a study abroad program, which I did in college in Oaxaca, Mexico. But when I came back, our dialects were different. We can communicate, but now I find it easier to read and write in Spanish than to speak it because I'm not immersed in it anymore. So again, there's that whole issue of immersion. And if we hear the language and how we then learn that literacy on top of that. So, I mean, there's multiple levels, and I'm glad people are chiming in. Thank you, Deborah, for that, because if it's not the generation, like for me, I wasn't the generation where I was punished, but my parents were. And typically in big families, the older siblings were. the ones that were punished. By the time the younger siblings in large families got to school, they kind of already were learning English in the home because they knew they would be made fun of. So you can see how that, again, I keep talking about transmission, but that's how it keeps going, and that's how it disrupts. When the language of the hearth is disrupted, and then it's being influenced when they step outside the home as well, as this idea of your language not being as prestigious as English. Catherine?
Good morning, Dr. Moreno. Thank you. I got on late, and so I fear that I missed the majority of your presentation, but I wanted to comment that I appreciate the comment that you made about making sure that programming includes the community. The teacher immersed in the classroom with the students can't do all of the work themselves, and it seems to me that in order to break down the barriers for young students where it's a frustrating process or an embarrassing process for them, that it needs to start as a conversation model. Establishing conversational Spanish, engaging students in play, and like low risk conversations so that they can get hooked and comfortable before they start to tackle sentence structure and conjugation and things like that. And so I know that I work at UNM Los Alamos, and so Joe Moreno and I have a connection through UNM, but my home community is the Peñasco area in northern New Mexico, and I know that there is bilingual immersion education at the school, but it is very much academic. They're studying out of textbooks, and so I would love to see programming that takes advantage of the fact that there are people in the community that still have those aspects of the old and I guess the Spanish that includes also some influence from Tiwa and Tewa areas in northern New Mexico, and have those conversations start happening before there isn't an opportunity anymore. As time goes by, those resources for spoken conversational Spanish are going to start to become less.
Right, I agree. Thank you, Catherine, for that, and it's good to see you again. But a couple of things with that. Internally as well, I think we have to understand that when we also have teachers that are from the community who are now in these programs, who hopefully are coming back to lead these classrooms, is to also not create a space where kids are afraid to mispronounce something or to say the wrong word, because we tend to correct our children in a way that where we could run the risk of them not wanting to speak the language at all. Or in classrooms where there are also Mexicanos, we hear things where the Nuevo Mexicanos kids will say Spanish is for school and English is for home. So you could see how students are also, when they're not given those opportunities to have the bridge, that bridge between community and school, when they're not given that opportunity, then they feel like they have to compartmentalize their language use. And then why are you doing it at that point? So, and then the last thing I want to say about that is our elders, as they pass, they take with them a lot of our culture and our language. And when we start to lose them, imagine having our elders in our classrooms with the ability to interact with our children, to